The first sign that something was wrong was that Daniel had stopped talking about staying. For most of our lives, our hometown had been the one thing we never questioned. We knew which streets flooded after heavy rain, which diners stayed open too late, which houses belonged to whose grandparents. We had grown up here, made mistakes here, and somehow kept finding our way back to the same places together. That afternoon, Daniel looked at me across the quiet corner where we had spent countless ordinary hours and said, "I'm leaving." I laughed at first because there was no way he could mean it. Daniel was the one who always talked me out of reckless decisions. He was supposed to be the practical one, but he did not smile. He told me he had already made preparations. He had a departure date. He had thought through what he would take and what he would leave behind. Then he looked directly at me and added, "I want you to come with me." That was when the joke disappeared from my mind. He was not asking me to take a weekend trip. He was asking me to leave the only town either of us had ever really called home. Together. I stared at him, waiting for some explanation that would make the request ordinary again. Maybe he was frustrated with work. Maybe something had happened with his family. Maybe he simply needed a change and had decided I was the easiest person to bring along. But Daniel kept watching me with an expression I could not read. "You have a little time to decide," he said. "I'm not asking you to answer right now." Somehow that made it worse. If he had been joking, I could have laughed. If he had been angry, I could have argued. Instead, he sounded certain. And for the first time in our friendship, I had the strange feeling that Daniel had already imagined a future that did not include this town, and had imagined me inside it. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to ask why me, but the question felt too dangerous to say out loud. So I asked the only thing I could manage. "Where are we going?" Daniel hesitated, then gave me the smallest smile. "Somewhere neither of us has ever been." I looked at him, at the familiar face I had known for most of my life, and realized that whatever he was planning, he had not asked me to hear it by accident. He had chosen me. I just did not yet understand why. Daniel did not say anything else for a moment. He simply waited, as if he understood that giving me more information would only make the decision feel heavier. I looked down at the table between us, then back at him. "You actually planned this?" I asked. "Enough of it," he said. "Not every detail." That sounded like him. Daniel could make a decision quickly, but he never pretended he could control everything that came afterward. I asked what leaving would actually look like, where we would stay, how long he intended to be gone, what he expected us to do once we got there. He answered each question calmly, without trying to sell me a dream. There was no grand speech about becoming different people or starting perfect new lives. He talked about finding somewhere affordable, getting work, figuring things out as they came. The more practical his answers became, the more difficult it was for me to dismiss the idea as a sudden impulse. "And you expect me to just leave?" I asked. "No," he said immediately. "I expect you to decide whether you want to." I studied him. That was another thing I knew about Daniel. When he really cared about something, he could be stubborn, but he hated forcing people into choices they had not made for themselves. I asked why he had chosen this moment. He looked away briefly before answering. "Because I think we keep saying someday." I knew exactly what he meant. We had been saying someday since we were young. Someday we would travel somewhere neither of us knew. Someday we would stop living according to everyone else's expectations. Someday we would do something that belonged entirely to us. Somehow, those promises had survived years of ordinary life without ever becoming real. I smiled despite myself. "You realize how crazy this sounds." Daniel finally smiled too. "I know. And you still want to do it?" "Yes." He said it without hesitation. Then he asked me what I would want if I could choose without worrying about what anyone expected from me. I almost gave him the easy answer. I almost said I wanted to stay because staying was familiar, because our families were here, because our routines were here, because leaving sounded like something people did when they had failed at staying. But Daniel was watching me carefully. He knew when I was avoiding a question. "I don't know," I admitted. He nodded as though that answer was enough. Then he told me he had thought about what I liked, what kind of place I would tolerate, and what would make the transition easier for me. I stared at him. You planned around me? I asked. Daniel's expression softened. Of course I did. The words were simple, almost ordinary, but they stayed with me. He had not merely imagined leaving. He had imagined leaving with me. And suddenly, the decision felt less like an escape from our hometown and more like a question about the two of us. Daniel's words followed me out of that conversation and into the evening. I kept thinking about the way he had said, "Of course I did," as if knowing what I needed was the most natural thing in the world. We had always been good at that. He knew when I wanted coffee without asking. He knew which parts of town I avoided when I was tired. He knew when I was upset even when I insisted I was fine. For years, I had treated those things as proof of how well two best friends could know each other. That night, for the first time, I wondered whether I had been using friendship as an explanation because it was the easiest one. Daniel and I had talked about leaving before. Not seriously, not with dates or plans, but often enough that the idea had become part of our private language. When we were younger, we used to sit somewhere quiet and imagine what it would be like to wake up in a place where nobody knew us. We would invent ridiculous versions of our future, argue about which cities would suit us, and promise that one day we would actually go. Then life became busy, and those conversations slowly became jokes. I had assumed Daniel had forgotten them. The next evening, when we met again, I mentioned one of those old conversations without thinking. Daniel went quiet. You remember that? He asked. I laughed. Of course I remember. He looked down for a second, then smiled in a way that felt strangely familiar. I didn't forget. Something about his answer unsettled me. I asked how long he had been thinking about leaving. He did not give me a simple number. Instead, he reminded me of a time years earlier when we had seriously considered going somewhere together, only to abandon the idea before either of us had to make a real decision. I remembered it differently. In my memory, we had both lost interest. Daniel said that was not how he remembered it. He had thought I was the one who wanted to stay. I stared at him. You thought I wanted to stay? He nodded. You were the one who said we weren't ready. I tried to remember the exact conversation. I remembered being afraid, but I also remembered Daniel becoming strangely distant afterward. At the time, I had assumed he was disappointed that the plan had failed. Now, hearing him describe it, I wondered if I had misunderstood what he had been disappointed about. Why didn't you ask me again? I said. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Because I thought you had made your choice. There was something in his voice that made the old memory feel heavier. I had always believed our friendship had simply continued because neither of us wanted anything else. But maybe that was not the whole story. Maybe some choices had been made for us because neither of us had been brave enough to ask what the other really wanted. Daniel looked toward the road, then back at me. That's why I don't want to keep saying someday. For the first time, I understood that his departure was not only about leaving a place. He had been carrying the idea of leaving with me for much longer than I had realized. And suddenly, the question I had been avoiding became impossible to ignore. If he had remembered all of this for so long, what exactly had he been waiting for? The question stayed between us as we walked through the familiar streets of our hometown. I wanted to ask Daniel what he had been waiting for, but I was afraid the answer would change something I was not ready to lose. Instead, I asked him about the night we had almost left years ago. I remember you barely. Spoke after we decided not to go. I said. I thought you were angry with me. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. I wasn't angry. Then what were you? He kept walking for several steps before answering. Disappointed. I waited. Because I thought you wanted it too. His answer made me stop. I did. Daniel turned toward me. That's not what I heard. We stood there, surrounded by places that had always felt permanent. The same road, the same houses, the same quiet evening sounds. For years, I had believed that old plan had simply faded because we had grown up. Now I wondered whether it had ended because we had misunderstood each other. I asked him what he thought I had meant back then. You said staying was safer, he replied. You said we couldn't just disappear and expect everything here to be fine. I remembered saying those words. What I did not remember was how carefully Daniel had listened to them. I was scared, I admitted. So was I. His answer came immediately. That surprised me. Daniel had always seemed more willing to take risks than I was. He was the one who could make a decision and move forward while I stood there calculating everything that could go wrong. But that night, I realized he had not been fearless. He had simply been better at hiding his fear. Then why did you act like it didn't matter? I asked. Daniel looked at me, and for a moment his expression changed. There was something vulnerable there, something I had seen before but never understood. Because I didn't want you to feel responsible for what I wanted. My chest tightened. I asked what he had wanted. He looked away. I wanted you to choose it yourself. The answer should have been simple. Instead, it made the space between us feel different. He had not been waiting for someone to convince him to leave. He had been waiting for me to decide whether I wanted the same future. I remembered all the times he had stayed beside me when he could have gone somewhere else. All the times he had adjusted his plans without making me feel guilty about it. Suddenly those memories seemed less ordinary. I still did not know what they meant, and Daniel did not explain them. But the possibility had entered the space between us, and neither of us could pretend it was not there. If we leave, I said quietly, everything changes. Daniel nodded. I know. He did not reach for me or make the moment more intimate than it was. He simply stood there, letting me decide whether I wanted to keep asking. And that was what frightened me most. I wanted to. Daniel waited without saying anything. I could feel the question forming in my throat, but saying it would mean admitting that I had started to see our past differently. What did you want back then? I finally asked. He looked at me for a long moment. I wanted to know if you would choose me. The answer landed harder than I expected. As your friend, I asked, even though I knew that was not what he meant. Daniel shook his head. Not only as my friend. Neither of us moved. The street suddenly felt too quiet. I had spent years believing that the safest thing about us was that we never had to explain what we were to each other. We were best friends. That was enough. It had protected us from questions, from expectations, from the possibility of losing something neither of us knew how to replace. But Daniel was looking at me now with the same expression he had carried through our old memories, and I understood that the silence between us had never been as empty as I thought. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. Because I knew what you were afraid of. You didn't know that. I did. He looked down briefly. You were afraid that if we wanted different things, we would lose each other. I could not argue with that. He had seen through me more clearly than I had seen through myself. And now? I asked. Daniel took a slow breath. Now I'm more afraid we'll lose each other by never saying anything. That was the first time he had said it so plainly. He was not giving me a complete confession, but he was no longer pretending that the future he wanted was simply about finding a new town. He had imagined something different with me, something neither of us had been willing to name. I felt my chest tighten as I remembered all the moments I had dismissed. The way he always looked for me first in a crowded room, the way he remembered every small detail I mentioned, the way he had stayed when leaving would have been easier. Suddenly, those memories did not feel like ordinary evidence of a lifelong friendship. They felt like pieces of a story I had refused to read. So that's why you want me to go with you? I asked. Daniel nodded. Partly. The word made me look at him. Partly? He hesitated. I don't want you to come because you feel guilty. I don't want you to come because you're scared of losing me. I want you to come if you actually want the life we're talking about. His voice softened. Even if that life becomes something neither of us expected. I understood then that he was giving me an answer and another question at the same time. The old mystery was no longer why he had chosen me. He had finally told me. The harder question was what I was going to do with the truth. I could stay and protect the friendship exactly as it had always been. Or I could admit that what I felt had already become something I could not safely call friendship anymore. Daniel did not ask me to decide that night. He simply stood beside me, close enough that I could feel how much had changed without either of us moving closer. And for the first time, I was afraid that choosing safety might be the choice that cost me him. The next morning, leaving no longer felt like an impossible idea. Felt like a decision waiting for me. Daniel and I spent the day going through the practical details of what we would need, what we could leave behind, and what would have to change if we actually followed through. None of it felt romantic. That was almost what made it harder. There were bags to think about, work to consider, familiar obligations we would be stepping away from, and 1,000 small questions that had never mattered when leaving was only something we talked about. Every practical question seemed to carry another emotional one underneath it. What would we lose if we went? What would we lose if we stayed? Daniel answered what he could, but he stopped trying to persuade me. That change was subtle. A few days earlier, he might have joked about dragging me out of town if he had to. Now he was careful not to make the choice for me. When I asked what he wanted me to do, he said, "I want you to choose what you can live with." I knew what he meant. He was not going to turn his feelings into a reason I had to follow him. He had finally told me what he had been afraid to say, and now he was giving me the same freedom he had wanted years ago. I found myself watching him whenever he was not looking at me. The way he folded something into his bag. The way he checked the departure details. The way he paused before putting another familiar thing aside. I realized that he was already preparing himself for the possibility that I might stay. That realization hurt more than I expected. "You really are going even if I don't come?" I asked. Daniel looked at me. "Yes." He said it gently, not coldly. "I have to." I nodded, but the answer left something heavy inside me. Before, I had imagined that he wanted me beside him so badly that he would keep asking until I agreed. Instead, he was making room for me to refuse, and that meant the choice was finally mine. I thought about our old conversation, the one where we had both been afraid and somehow managed to hear completely different things. I thought about how many years we had spent protecting our friendship by never asking what it could become. Now the truth was sitting between us, and there was no way to put it back where it had been. I still did not know what leaving would mean. I did not know whether the life waiting beyond our hometown would work, or whether we would discover that wanting something together was easier than building it. But I knew something else. Daniel was no longer asking me to escape with him because he needed someone beside him. He had told me what he felt, and he was prepared to leave without me rather than make me responsible for it. For the first time, I understood that his silence was not pressure. It was trust, and somehow that made staying feel much more frightening. By the time the departure was close enough to feel real, I had run out of reasons to pretend I still had plenty of time. Daniel had finished preparing what he needed, and I could see the difference in him. He was quieter now, not because he was angry or disappointed, but because he had stopped waiting for me to make a decision he could not make for me. That silence followed us through the last evening in town. We moved through familiar places without pretending they meant nothing. Every street seemed to carry some version of our lives together. Every ordinary thing suddenly felt temporary. I wanted to tell Daniel that I was still thinking about everything he had said. I wanted to tell him that I had been thinking about it constantly. Instead, I kept asking practical questions, as if practical questions could protect me from the one that mattered. "What happens if I stay?" I finally asked. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "You stay," he said. "You keep your life here. I leave." There was no bitterness in his voice. That was what made it hurt. "And us?" I asked. He lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "I don't know." I had expected him to reassure me. I had expected him to say that nothing would change, that we would call, visit, and somehow remain exactly the same. But neither of us believed that anymore. I understood that leaving would change our friendship. Staying would change it too. There was no safe version left. Daniel had given me the truth, and now the truth had consequences. He told me he did not want me to come because I was afraid of losing him. He wanted me to come because I genuinely wanted the life we had been discussing. I looked at him and realized how much restraint that required. He could have reminded me of everything we had shared. He could have asked me to promise that I would follow. Instead, he was preparing to leave without knowing what I would choose. "You really won't ask me again?" I said. He shook his head. "I already asked." I swallowed hard. "And if I say no?" His expression tightened, just for a second. Then he nodded. "I'll respect it." That was the moment the possibility of losing him became real. Not because he threatened to leave me behind, but because he was willing to accept my choice even if it broke his heart. I had spent years believing that avoiding the truth protected what we had. Now I understood the opposite. Silence could not keep us unchanged. It could only decide our future without asking either of us what we wanted. Daniel began preparing to leave, and I watched him move through the room with the familiarity of someone I had known almost my entire life. Soon, he would walk out of our hometown and continue without me if that was what I chose. For the first time, I could see the future clearly enough to fear it. He might leave alone. I might stay, and we might become two people who had once been inseparable, separated not by distance, but by everything we had been too afraid to say. The next morning, I watched Daniel make the final preparations to leave, and something inside me finally stopped asking for more time. He was not waiting for me anymore. He had accepted that he might walk out of our hometown alone, carrying everything he had hoped we could build together without knowing whether I would be there. I had spent years thinking that courage meant making sure nothing changed. Now I understood that sometimes the harder choice was admitting that something had already changed. I followed him when he was ready to go. "Daniel." He stopped and turned around. For a second, neither of us spoke. I could see the question in his face, but he did not ask it. He had promised he would not pressure me again. So this time I had to say it myself. "I'm coming with you." His expression shifted, but he stayed completely still. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He looked at me carefully, as though he needed to know whether I was saying it because I was afraid of losing him. I understood the question beneath his question. "I'm not coming because I don't want to lose my best friend," I said. "I'm coming because I don't want to keep pretending that's all you are to me." Daniel's eyes softened. He looked down for a moment, then back at me. I could feel how much those words cost me. I had spent years protecting our friendship by refusing to name what I felt. Saying it now meant giving up that protection. It meant accepting that things could become complicated, that leaving would not magically make the future easier, and that there was no guarantee we would know how to build the life we had imagined. But I also knew that staying simply because it was familiar was no longer an honest choice. "I want to try," I told him, "not just leaving us." Daniel let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for years. He stepped closer, slowly enough to give me every chance to change my mind. I did not. When he reached for my hand, the gesture felt different from every time he had touched me before. There was no pretending it was only habit or friendship. I held his hand back. For a moment we just stood there, both of us understanding that the choice had finally been made. Then Daniel asked, almost quietly, "So you're really choosing this?" I looked at him and smiled. "I'm choosing you." That was the moment the future became real. We were not leaving because the hometown had defeated us. We were leaving because neither of us wanted to keep living inside a version of our lives that no longer fit. Daniel squeezed my hand, and together we turned toward the road ahead. The town was still behind us. Everything familiar was still there. But for the first time, I was not afraid of what we were leaving. I was thinking about what we were choosing. And as we walked away side by side, I realized that running away had never been the real question. The real question had always been whether, when we finally had the freedom to choose, we would choose each other. This time, we did. The first hours away from our hometown felt strangely quiet. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden certainty that everything ahead of us would work exactly as we imagined. There was only the unfamiliar road, the things we had brought with us, and the knowledge that neither of us had turned back. Daniel sat beside me, and for once neither of us needed to pretend that our closeness had an ordinary explanation. We had made the choice together. That did not erase the years we had spent afraid of changing our friendship, but it gave those years a different meaning. We had not been wrong to value what we had. We had simply been afraid to ask whether it could become more. I thought about the old promise we had made when we were younger, when leaving town together had been nothing more than something we talked about. Back then, I had believed the important part was getting away. Now I understood that the place had never been the real obstacle. We could have gone anywhere and carried the same silence with us if we had never faced what we felt. Daniel looked over at me and smiled. Still think this is crazy? He asked. I smiled back. Absolutely. He laughed, and the sound felt familiar enough to remind me that choosing something new had not erased who we were. It had only allowed us to stop hiding behind the safest name for it. We still had no perfect plan. We still had to build a life beyond the place that had shaped us. But now we would face those uncertainties as two people who had deliberately chosen each other, not as best friends accidentally running from home together. I thought about the way Daniel had first asked me to leave. At the time, I had wondered why he needed me beside him. Now I knew. He had not simply wanted someone familiar on the road. He had wanted the person he loved to choose the road with him. And I had finally done it. We had left our hometown, but we had not really run away. We had left behind the version of ourselves that believed safety was worth more than honesty. The road ahead was unfamiliar, but Daniel was beside me, his hand finding mine without hesitation. This time, neither of us pulled away. We were not running away anymore. We were going somewhere together,